And I'm gonna introduce myself real quick. So if you're not familiar, I'm Eric Olson. As my name tag here shows, I'm with Extension Lakes. We are a program that is part of the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership. We're the sort of education and outreach partner that's based out of the College of Natural Resources at UW-Stevens Point. And we've been carrying out some sort of support function for lake organizations for almost 50 years. And I'm happy to be, and I have not been doing it for that long. I've only been here for about 11 years, but the entire time I've been here, I've been working with Mike Engleson. Mike Engleson is now the executive director for Wisconsin Lakes. They're your statewide advocacy and networking organization for both lake associations, lake districts, as well as people who care about lakes. So I will pass the mic over to Mike.
Thank you, Eric, and hello, everybody. Welcome again to this, the final in our spring series of Thursday at 4 webinars. So since it's the season finale, we do intend to bring this back in the fall with some more topics. I'll try to end strong, but maybe not with a cliffhanger. We'll see how that works. But if you are paying attention to your screen, you can see that the title of the talk changed slightly from what we had advertised. I changed it to Managing Recreational Impacts on Lakes from Regulating, because I want to make sure that we take into account more than just the policy sort of pieces of all of this, but we are talking about recreational impacts on lakes. And this has become a top priority for Wisconsin Lakes. Our board of directors, we've discussed this, and this has become a top priority for the year for us. And we've kind of broken this up into 4 different categories or pieces of the platform that we're going to be working on. And I'm showing them to you now, kind of give you some background of where my organization is coming from on this issue. Many of you, I'm guessing, that are on this call have emailed me or talked to me or are going to email me or talk to me, especially about wake boats and that particular issue, which is certainly a key part of all of this. And I'm sure we'll have some conversation about that. And boating in general is certainly a key part of it too. But we really are thinking about this in terms of the total the total spectrum of the different kinds of recreational use that hit lakes and can have impacts. So this slide just sort of runs through the different kinds. The on-water ones, I think, are probably obvious and are what you were thinking we were going to be talking about today. So things like swimming and fishing, power boats, and using jet skis, any of the kind of stuff we do on the water. But all of those off-water items can also have an impact on lakes and at least have some relation to recreational use. So there's shoreline day use, just the families that come to a park and use the swim beach and sit and picnic. Campgrounds and short-term home rentals are becoming an important issue, especially in some parts of the state, as it increases the density and the number of people that are on the lakes, especially for a shorter period of time. That can have a lot of impacts. And I have to say that I think it would be wrong for us not to take into account what residential development does as well. I'm guessing that a large percentage of you are waterfront property owners. And so we have to take into account our own impacts as waterfront property owners as to how that impacts the lake along with everything else. But just to look at a few statistics that sort of prove the point that this is becoming a greater and greater issue. We know that there were a large number of power boats that were sold in the US in the last year. That's a 12% increase from 2019. According to the numbers that I found, there was about an 8% increase. I think this may have been over a several year period in the number of personal watercraft, so jet skis and the like, sold, and probably a 20% increase in wake boats. We know that wake boats are one of the largest sectors of boating sales that are growing in the country. In Wisconsin, Boat sales increased by 9% last year. Registrations rose by 2% to just over 621,000. The interesting thing I found in my research is that that's not actually the high. As recently as 2017, we had almost 625,000 boats registered in the state. And in 2011, it was 629,000. That's according to information from Department of Natural Resources. So we're on an uptick, but we're not necessarily back up to where we were. The thing you have to keep in mind with registration numbers for boats in Wisconsin is that those are only state resident users. You don't have to register your boat if you're a non-resident, and it also is only motorized watercraft. So it doesn't count things like canoes and kayaks and those kind of boats. We also know that fishing license sales are up. So there's no doubt that there is more pressure from more watercraft and more people, and watercraft that is probably larger and more powerful. And there's also a greater number of smaller boats as well, which makes, you know, potential safety conflicts all the worse. And I don't, despite what I found from boater registrations, my sense is that this isn't just a pandemic related increase, that this didn't just come about because of COVID-19, but this and people, you know, wanting to get outside and doing the thing they can do. This really is a trend that has been growing over time. So these impacts these uses bring about a bunch of different kinds of impacts. And this basic breakout is I took from a paper that was actually written in 1994. I'll reference it throughout this talk, by Lowell, who was the founder of the Lakes Partnership. It's called Load Limits for Lakes. And he breaks out recreational impact to both personal and then the ecological, environmental kinds of impacts. So on the personal side, you have the obvious safety impacts. You get a lot of watercraft out there, a lot of people doing a lot of different things, some of them moving pretty quickly, maybe kicking up bigger waves than used to. You have a personal safety issue that certainly has to be taken care of. But there are also frustration or dissatisfaction impacts where people are trying to use the lake for a particular use, and they become dissatisfied or frustrated because other people are using it in a different way. That might even expand to displacement, where a group that would normally go to a particular lake decides we're just not going to do that anymore because it's gotten so problematic to be on that water because of the number and types of activities that are going on. So the personal impacts from recreation can be looked at not just in terms of safety issues. On the ecological and environmental impact side, of course, it's the same sorts of stuff that you would expect. There can be habitat destruction. There can be water quality issues created because maybe sediment or pollutants in the lake bottom get kicked up by all of the activity that can reduce water quality and cause problems. And the more people and the more watercraft you have entering our waters, the more likely it is that there's going to be some sort of unintentional aquatic invasive species transfer. So those are all sorts of impacts that I think we need to look at and be careful about. So as I mentioned, the Lowell Classics Load Limits for Lakes paper published in 1994, almost a manifesto if you find it and read it, is something that I'm going to be talking about, especially later on in this talk. But in terms of talking about carrying capacity, I'll be speaking mostly from experience that Lake Ripley in Cambridge had. They did a carrying capacity study in 2003. You can read the whole study. It's on their website as the chapter 3 of their improvement plan for the lake is all about that study really, and lays it out quite nicely. So I'm talking mostly off of that. So to get into this idea of carrying capacity, and the reason I think it's important to talk about this first is because this sort of like it can help you look at your own lake or look at lakes in general and make some determinations. I think the way it's laid out, the way that Lake Ripley did it, it's not even that difficult to do, and kind of a back of the envelope, really quick calculus. You don't necessarily have to do a deep study to figure out whether you're close or not, above or under your lake's carrying capacity. Though certainly if you are able to do a study that is sound and scientific, you're going to have better results. But what we talk about when we talk about carrying capacity is the number of watercraft that can simultaneously operate on the lake without, one, compromising user safety, two, causing significant user displacement or dissatisfaction, and three, causing an environmental harm to the resource. So you can kind of see those categories of impacts that I talked about a couple of slides ago are reflected here in the definition of carrying capacity that was used, that has been used in a number of places, but was used at Lake Ripley. So the methodology, there are 5 steps here. It really kind of boils down to 2 in the simplified form. But step 1 is to calculate the usable lake area, figure out how much water is available for use for these sorts of activities. And then the second step is to choose the optimum boating density. So how many boats can you have? And you do that by going through steps 2 through 4. And then at the end, you can take that information and look at it, compare it to what's happening currently on your lake, and figure out whether or not you're over capacity or under capacity, or if you're getting close and need to really think about some management techniques to the extent that there are some available. So the first step, again, is determining usable area. And it's, again, fairly simple to do, I think. You can get a good general sense of it just by knowing your lake fairly well. So the first thing is to take away any area that is already user restricted. So there might be a designated swim area. There might be areas that are designated by ordinance as slow no wake or something like that, because it's a shallow bay or it's a sensitive wildlife area or something like that. There are these zones around an area around the shoreline and other protected areas where slow no wake is 100 feet for everything but jet skis. Jet skis are 200 feet. But so that area can be taken away. Arguably, you could really take away the whole 200-foot zone, because the idea is to try to figure out how much usable area there is that's absolutely unrestricted. For this example, I just used the 100-foot zone. But once you've done that, once you've figured out taken away the area that is already restricted, then under the way Lake Ripley did it, you can look at other areas in the lake that are might need protection because they're very shallow, or they have again sensitive wildlife areas that haven't yet been protected. Now, I didn't get a chance to talk to anybody that went through that process or conducted that study for them. That strikes me as a potentially difficult area because it's not necessarily entirely objective. It's, you know, whether or not something is already restricted by another law, all of those decisions have been made already. And so that's objective. You know that you can't do that kind of boating there. To say that there are other areas in the lake that should be, there's a good quantity of politics that goes into that decision, as well as the science behind it. But I can understand why you would want to include that in your calculus, because if you know that that's an area that really shouldn't be used by boats in general for whatever reason, or shouldn't have wakes created, taking that out gives you an accurate determination of what what the area is. I guess my point is that determination may not be the same if made by different groups. So there's a level to where there's this is determining carrying capacity might be as almost as much an art as it is a science, or at least not every group is going to come up with the same result every time. So to give a very simple example of this, I created the example of a really round lake. Doesn't actually exist because it's a perfect circle, but it makes the math really easy. I think I did the math right. I used an online calculator, so I trusted the internet. You know, what I came up with when I just took out the 100-foot Slono Wake area is that you end up with about 38.7 acres of usable space under this analysis. So this didn't involve any other areas. There wasn't any kind of environmentally protected area or anything like that. It was just the 100-foot Slono Wake zone from the shore, and you end up with about 38.7 acres. Take into consideration that that most lakes aren't even close to being round like this, and the different variations in shoreline and distances and things like that are going to impact usable area as well. So those are all things that you need to take into account. Once you figure out your usable area, then you can look at what the optimal boating density is. And the first step in that process is to look at what the estimated area for various types of watercraft would need. So for instance, a fishing boat doesn't need as many acres of water to operate as, say, a water ski boat does, because a water ski boat's going to be traveling faster, covering a lot more water most of the time. And so it's going to be using larger stretches of open water than probably a fishing boat would, who, when it's, doing what it's designed to do, sit there and let the people in it fish, it's not going to be moving around. Obviously, it travels from place to place, but just not as much. So really, from my understanding of how these spatial requirement estimates have been developed is mostly based on on the perceptions of other users. So, looking at focus groups and doing surveys and figuring out at what point does too much of this boat become problematic, and what's too much to make this stink as far as being an activity. So it doesn't really take into account any of the environmental impacts from what I could tell. So that's something that we have to think about moving forward. But you can take that information and then develop a sliding scale, because you probably have also gone through the process of doing a census of boater activity to determine when the peak times are, and at those peak times, how many boats are usually on the lake, and what are the different activities that are going on. So is your lake mostly a quiet fishing lake, or do you have a lot of water ski activity, or is it a wide range of just about everything? Like many lakes have told me now. What Lake Ripley found was that their range was about 10 to 30 acres per boat, and that depends on the activity. So if there's fishing going on, a fishing boat needs about 10 acres. A water skier might need closer to 30. The range for your lake might not be the same, because maybe you don't have a lot of water skiing going on. So your range then really is only 10 to 20, which can make a difference as to how close you are to carrying capacity. But it also shows that these kind of carrying capacity studies, they're not really permanent. They don't last forever. You need to keep looking at this idea and redoing the calculations to some degree, because maybe the kind of boating on your lake changes. As more development comes in and more people come on, it might change. And honestly, as new forms of boats come around, the Lake Ripley study was done in 2003. And I know as recently as a few years ago, I talked to some people from there, and wake boating was not an issue at all. There weren't any wake boats being operated there at all, as I understood it. So once a larger boat that has these new types of issues comes on, that's going to change your carrying capacity calculus as well. So it needs to be a living document that you're thinking about as you go through it. So to get back to really round lake, based on the 10 to 30 range, which from what I've seen from other studies, that seems like it's pretty consistently around in that area. You know, that's really 3 to 4 boats out fishing or one boat traveling at high speed. 50 acres by state statute actually is all slow no wake. I used the smallest lake possible before you would even get into thinking about wakes with high speed on purpose. Partially because, and I didn't do like 50.1 because to extrapolate higher, the math just works really well at 50 acres. So you can see if you go up to 200 acres, you know, that's 4 times the size. We're still really talking 12 boats fishing and 4 boats traveling, or 4 boats traveling at a high speed, which isn't a whole lot. And you start seeing how fast you can run into some capacity issues, especially when you have multiple different activities going on. So you've got a couple people fishing, a couple people trying to water ski, some sailboats, you know, and a family out stand-up paddleboarding. You don't have to be that small of a lake to start running into some potential carrying capacity issues. So what do we do about this? That's why we're here, right? Well, before I get into that, I want to take one step back. As we do in almost every talk about water in Wisconsin, you have to bring up the Public Trust Doctrine because it's the thing that governs most of what we do on the water. And for those of you who don't know, it is a constitutional doctrine. It's written into the Wisconsin state constitution. The doctrine itself actually goes all the way back to Roman law. It flowed through into English common law, moved over to the states along with British colonists, and then became enshrined in our state constitution. And it says explicitly, the waters of Wisconsin shall be common highways and forever free, as well to the inhabitants of the state as to the citizens of the United States, without any tax, impost, or duty therefore. What that meant when it was first, when the Constitution was first enacted, was that you couldn't block off a river and charge a toll for people to bring goods down on boats or float logs down from where they were cut down to the timber mill. That the water had to stay open and you had to be able to allow navigable passage. Over time, that idea has been expanded by the Wisconsin courts to include things like recreation, and we've got a whole regulatory framework through mostly through DNR, but some through other agencies, mostly DNR, where they've been given authority by the state legislature to regulate the public trust and make sure that our waters are kept safe and clean and accessible for us. That idea, the idea that sort of has come out of all of this, is that that means that we all have access and equal access to the waters, and we all get to use it, and we don't really need to think about other people when we do. And Lowell had some questions about that, whether we were really conceptualizing it right, especially as we got more and more and bigger watercraft and different kinds of recreational impacts. So what he said in Load Limits for the Lakes is that without legislated restraint, democratically adopted free public resources like water are inevitably trampled by too many users. Remember, this was written in 1994, by a single well-organized group, or by technology that simply overwhelms other uses and sometimes destroys the natural resource itself. Based on my conversations with many people that have called me with questions and problems on their lakes because of this issue, 28 years later, I think that holds still pretty true. He goes on to say that the importance placed on the public trust doctrine has also led some users to feel they have a right to use any lake at any time. They extrapolate their right of access to the water and extend it to any activity their equipment might allow them to perform. Now, I think when we think about it, we don't really mean that, and I think anybody would agree to it. I mean, you can see some uses there down at the bottom, paddling, and that's a wake boat there and a sailboat traveling. I don't think, actually, these are all stock photographs, so I don't think any of them are on Wisconsin lakes. I don't think that we would say that this would be appropriate if this was a picture of Big Green Lake, to have a gigantic yacht brought in and placed on the lake, right? At some, something like that started to happen frequently. Wouldn't take too long for us to start advocating for some legislation that would prevent that from happening, because it obviously impedes the use and the rights of other people. So Lowell talked about the idea that we need to have both inclusive and integrated lake management policies to deal with these problems. And that he came up with 4 primary goals that I will go through, because I think they're actually really important. And when we came up with our platform for Wisconsin Lakes, for how we were dealing with this, those 4 points that I talked about earlier, and I'll be going through each of them in a moment. We didn't have these goals in mind. We kind of came up with what we were thinking, but when I read these, I'm like, this is pretty much exactly what we were talking about, distilled in a much more concise and well said manner. So the first goal he has is aesthetic opportunity. And I think it's interesting that he put it first, because it's probably the one that we don't realize that we're thinking about first, but I think almost everybody does when we talk about lakes. And it's the idea that lakes are really beautiful. And that's one of the biggest values that we bring when we think about why lakes are important to us. It's that ability to quietly enjoy a lake. It's that ability to just enjoy the view shed that we see from our home or from the campground, or when we're out on the water in a boat, no matter how we gained access to that water body. And so that's something that's a goal that whatever we do, we want to make sure that we don't harm that aesthetic opportunity. The recreational opportunity is, of course, important to all of us. I mean, it's important to all of us in different ways. And as Lowell points out, we often will end up, especially lately, I mean, and again, he was saying this in 1994, and I don't think it's gotten any better, that one user group decides that ours is the most important thing, and we're going to defend it at all costs, and our recreational opportunity trumps all recreational opportunities. We have to be really careful to remember that's not the case. That's not the idea behind the public trust. And so we have to make sure that we protect our both all of those personal and environmental interests. But the idea is that we want to have policies that are inclusive and integrated, even in terms of recreational opportunity. Of course, I think I would argue that environmental security maybe is the most important, that we don't want to degrade our waters. We want to protect them from things like aquatic invasive species. We want to keep that lake sediment as settled as possible, so legacy phosphorus doesn't get released and we end up getting bad algae blooms. All of those sorts of things that can happen, all the things that can happen to a shoreline. All of that plays into economic opportunity as well. If you end up with a dissatisfied group of users of a lake, they may be eventually displaced and stop going to that lake because of a couple of people who are bad actors, who are causing, if not lots of damage, at least enough problems that that these other groups no longer want to be on that lake. Well, it might be that the businesses around that lake depend on the larger number of users to be there, and so there's an economic cost if those impacts lead to that point. And so economic opportunity is another goal that we have to keep in mind. Obviously, we know tourism is one of the most important economic drivers, especially in the northern part of the state, and property values of lakefront property are a huge boon to local property tax bases as well. So all of that is important. So that brings us to what we're talking about and what we're trying to do. And we've broken, by we, I mean Wisconsin Lakes. Just so it's clear, Wisconsin Lakes, we have 2 staff people. It's myself and a half-time membership and development person. So I'm the staff person that does most of the work on this. I'm the executive director. And then I have a board of directors that works with me. We have 10 people on the board at the moment. And so I depend on them, and I thank them for all the hard work and volunteer effort they do in terms of consultation and helping guide the organization. And what we've come up with is this sort of four pillared platform of what we want to do. Sometimes I call this an initiative. Sometimes I call it a program. I haven't really come up with a good name for it. What I want to make sure is that it's understood that this is not just a policy advocacy thing that we're doing. This is very comprehensive and covers a lot of different areas of use. So research and understanding, education, management and enforcement on the local level, and then strong supportive statewide policies. And I'll go through each of these individually. So for research and understanding, and by the way, there's an article that is in the new Lake Tides, the newsletter publication from Extension Lakes. There's an article that we wrote that lays all of this out that I'm describing as well. So research and understanding really is twofold. We need that sort of basis of rigorous scientific understanding of these impacts. So in terms of wake boats are still relatively new. There haven't been a lot of independent broad studies done. There have been a lot of localized studies done on different lakes. And there have been some industry-funded general scientific studies that have provide some interesting results, but may have some people have said have some issues with them as well. There's a study going on right now in the University of Minnesota that we had hoped that there was going to be some information released from that next week, actually. That actually has been delayed because the amount of time it's been taken for them to go through the data and get it peer reviewed has not worked out. There's a number of different studies on carrying capacity from all around the world, on wave impacts, I'm sure on some of the other issues as well. So the point isn't that we have to just always wait for studies to come up, but we want to make sure that when we're talking about particular things, we have the best science that we can have. And then we also need to remember the social science end of things, which we've talked about a lot in the Lakes and Rivers Partnership, because it's important to understand just because you have science doesn't mean people change their minds about things. So what's the social science behind this? What are people's intuitive reactions to these sorts of issues? And how can we use those ideas to make that happen? And yes, for those of you who are really paying attention to the slides, I know that the top slide is actually just math. And the bottom slide is just like it was the stock image I found that seemed closest to like that. They look like they're doing like some sort of social science. Social science often involves maps, right? So they've got maps there. So that's where I use those stock photos. The second piece is lake user education. In the Lake Tides article, I actually called it boater education, but I decided that it really needed to probably be expanded because we're not necessarily just talking about boaters, though I think a lot of the focus of what we as an organization will be doing will be looking at boaters, because most of the impacts that are currently happening, or the ones that, or at least the ones that we really want to focus on in the short term, will have to do with boating. But users really need to fully understand their impacts and how those impacts affect others and the lake environment. So that ties into the social science piece, right? We need the science, then we need to understand how to communicate the science. And from there, we get people to have at least a rudimentary understanding of what's going on. To do that, we'll work with state, local governments. We'll work with the boating, water recreation industries themselves and other nonprofit organizations to try to get all of that underway. It's a whole lot easier when you get into talking about regulating things if people understand or at least are aware that some people believe there's a problem. If they're coming at it from having no idea that this is an issue, it's even harder, I think, than if they may not agree that there's an issue, but at least they know that people have been talking about it as something that's problematic. And the pictures on this slide show a number of educational kind of things that have happened over time. You have everything from signage, like the Slow No Wake sign, to big programs like Healthy Lakes, which is also a granting program that helps shoreland owners put in good shoreline practices, but definitely has an educational component in teaching people about those practices and why they're helpful. Clean Boats, Clean Waters teaches people about how to clean their boats and makes them aware of the problem of aquatic invasive species transport. And there's the Own Your Own Wake program. There's another one, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, that the Water Sports Industry Association has about wakes and how to responsibly use wake boats and try to minimize the impacts of them. So these are all sorts of things that we're looking at, and there will be lots of other ideas that come out of this as well, I hope. Then there's the local management and enforcement piece, which is of course important, and which many of you are working on pieces of this probably right now. The reason that I think it's important to look at this from a local management and local regulation standpoint is because lakes are unique. No one lake is the same, and it's very hard for many of these impacts to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. I'll use wake boats again. There's been talk, numbers have been thrown out over what the adequate distance would be for a setback for a zone from shore that where enhanced wakes would not be allowed. Some people say it's 200, 250, 300. I've heard as much as 700. The data kind of in the studies is all over the place. And the reason that it's all over the place is because the studies are done on specific water bodies, and those water bodies are all different. And so if the number that I've heard most that seems to be settled on even by some people who are arguing for these kind of setbacks is right around 300. So there's I think it's Payette Lake in Idaho. That study recommended 300. I just read a study from a couple of lakes in northern Georgia that also mentioned 300, and I've seen that elsewhere. A lot of times the 300 number is thrown out because that's what is perceived to be politically feasible. So what that means to me is that if you apply that uniformly across all lakes in an area, you're going to get some lakes where it's not necessary. Maybe it's a very deep lake. There's not a lot of development. The shoreline is the type of shoreline that can withstand more waves than you would normally expect. And so that lake, a 200-foot distance might be just fine. Other lakes, 300 feet might not be enough because they're very shallow, and we are beginning to see good evidence that shallow waters, the enhanced wakes, will kick up bottom sediment. And so if it's 5 feet deep, 800 feet out into the lake, there's potential impacts there. Depth also changes the way the waves travel and all that sort of thing. So, and then as I mentioned before, the silly example of really round lake isn't reasonable because there's all sorts of variations in the shoreline, where bays are, narrowing areas, and all that sort of thing. So it really is hard to craft a one-size-fits-all solution, not only for wake boats, but for most impacts. And you can't, and I'll get into some specific ways in a second as to how you can look at locally the kinds of tools that have been used and what you might be able to do. But before that, the other big caveat is that there's an enforcement problem in that these sorts of things are really hard to enforce. there's not enough law enforcement that's able to do these things. Many lakes, it would be just almost impossible to have law enforcement there all the time because of the cost alone. The funding just doesn't exist for it. And so enforcement is definitely something that we need to look at. I always remind people that enforcement is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily not work just because the enforcement doesn't happen 100% of the time. We don't expect that speed limits are enforced universally all the time. We expect that they are enough that people understand that the jurisdiction that has set that speed limit is serious about it, that for whatever the reason is, it's been set, and that there's a chance that you might get a ticket if you drive that fast. For some people, they'll just ignore it and blow past it. For some people, they'll drive maybe a little bit over the speed limit, but they won't really be breaking it much. But for nearly everybody, I think that we've learned there's probably a reason that the speed limit on Main Street is 25 miles per hour instead of 65 miles per hour like it is on the highway, or 70 miles per hour. And so we've developed a cultural sense of, okay, there's a reason we have to be careful here. And these sorts of slow no wake rules and other things that will suggest, as long as there's some ability to do some enforcement, I think do have some ability to be effective. So what kind of things am I talking about? Well, there's self-regulation. That's basically where a lake organization or a local entity doesn't pass anything that actually has any force of law or penalties related to it. But maybe there's some signage put up at a boat landing that says, we really, our lake association would really like you to be able to consider not doing high boat activities from 5 o'clock in the evening until sunup, Monday through Thursday. And on the weekend, but on the weekends, it's okay. Just so that we have that there are some periods on the lake where there's some quiet time. There's nothing that's enforceable about that. But again, it's an educational tool. It lets people know that this is something that maybe they could think about. And there are some lakes, I think, that do that in concert with other explicit ordinances. And you can spell that out in signage, even at landings and other places. You can some lakes have tried to at least control the amount of traffic on a lake by the design of their public access points. You have to be careful because there are potential public trust implications in restricting access, and DNR looks favorably on it sometimes and less favorably at other times because of that. But you can, if a landing is harder for a larger boat to get into, it may not be that larger boaters find other lakes to go to. I've read examples of places that have changed the way they structure their parking lots so that the parking is more amenable to certain types of watercraft carrying devices, trailers, than others. That doesn't always work. There are many, many instances that I've heard of over the years of places that have persistent problems of not enough parking and people park on town roads, and that they're still trying to get onto the lake. So this is by no means a perfect solution, but it is an option that people have tried. There are access fees that can be charged, but you really can only charge them in order to pay for the upkeep of the landing. And this is a local government that has to be doing this. In some limited instances, lake districts can be given permission. Lake associations and nonprofit groups cannot pass ordinances or charge landing fees or anything like that. It has to go through the local government. So there are places that have public access fees. You have to buy a permit to be able to park at the landing, and that helps pay for the upkeep of the landing. And then there are what are called time and space zoning restrictions. So these would be the kinds of ordinances that maybe on many of your lakes where water skiing is not allowed at a particular time of day. or there are particular parts of a lake that are designated as slow no wake because they are very shallow, or again of sensitive environmental, have sensitive environmental areas, and the consequences of having large wakes and a lot of traffic through those areas would be problematic. And so those kinds of ordinances can be passed by local municipalities, or in those limited instances, sometimes a lake district. And that's another way of local enforcement. It's difficult, if not impossible, to regulate based on the boat type, the horsepower of the boat, or to even use speed limits on a lake. Boating or local boating ordinances are subject to review by DNR and can be rejected. I know of at least one town, Presque Isle in Vilas County, attempted to do an ordinance restricting wake boat use. I should have reviewed it before before I came on, because I don't remember the explicit wording that they used. But DNR, the review of that, kicked it out. They felt that it it was too restrictive based on boat type or features of the boat or something like that. And so maybe someone will know about that and can fill us in when we get to the general discussion part. But that got kicked out. DNR did not like that. I've seen other instances of ordinances that are designed around enhanced wakes or other things that have been accepted. There are other non on the water for the sorts of uses like campgrounds and things like that. There are just general zoning ordinances that might come into play that that you could work through with your county or with your town that might help out with those sorts of issues. And then finally, we have to look to the state for strong, supportive statewide policies. And that's especially where I think we come in. We're situated to work with the legislature and the Department of Natural Resources to the extent we can. If there are statewide regulations that are appropriate and make sense over time, maybe we do come up with a number of feet from shore figure that does make a lot of sense. And because we've experienced what's going on locally, we've looked at it, we have science to back it up. And so we can say, okay, yeah, 350 feet seems to make sense, and we can advocate for statewide regulations. We want to make sure, and this is a problem that I think we, the most likely problem we're to run into with this is that we want to make sure that the state government allows localities to do the kinds of local control that we want. We've seen when the environment has come into play, local control be pulled away from local governments. Not that long ago, in 2015, shoreline zoning, it was allowed that counties could have shoreline zoning ordinances with standards stronger than the state. The legislature and governor both said they didn't like that idea. They wanted uniform shoreline zoning across the state. And so they pulled away, they took away local control over shoreline zoning matters and mandated that the state standards were the law of the land all across the state of Wisconsin. Funding is a big issue. How do we fund the law enforcement that we need? There are a couple of weeks ago, there was one of our Thursday at 4 webinars was on local boating enforcement aids and local boating enforcement. So you may have learned a little bit about how that works. There's not probably enough funding. Governor Evers did ask for another 1.8 million over the 2-year budget that is being considered right now. So far, the Joint Finance Committee has not been real excited about putting any kind of new funding into the state spending, and so we don't anticipate that will survive. It's possible that it may, but certainly advocating for funding on a statewide level for all these sorts of things is important, and we can do that. And then, I've sort of alluded to this last point all along here. The current political climate has to be taken into account. The legislature and the governor don't agree on anything. There's a huge divide in the state. The legislature is routinely rejecting pretty much anything where there are pots of money that are being spent or new funding. All of that has to be taken into account moving forward, even as we go into next year's elections, and then in 2024 with a gubernatorial election up, if we return to a place where there's all controlled by one party, that changes the calculus and how things would wash out. So then finally, what can you do through all of this to help out? One big thing that you can do is just document what your local situation is through videos, through photos, through written journaling, however you want to do it. I think the more you can do to help document what the problems are and make it help craft that into a story, the better we're going to be able to get things done either on a local level, on a influencing other users level, and even on a statewide level. So science, as I said earlier, is important to have. Good stories are essential. We'll get much more done if we have good stories. It wasn't the science that showed that smoking causes lung cancer that helped the anti-smoking movement, or whatever you want to call it. It was stories of people with horrible cancer talking about it that help lead to change. And that goes across just about any kind of issue. And so that definitely is something that would be helpful. As assuming that most of the people on this Zoom are waterfront property owners, and members of lake organizations, starting a conversation with other lake stakeholders about all of the different kinds of recreational impacts, maybe working with them to do carrying capacity studies. All of that is really crucial and important to get underway. It's important to talk to if there's a local or a regional fishing club, if there is a group of power boaters that have an association in the area, it's probably important to start talking to them about these sorts of things. We've seen a lot of progress, maybe not as fast as we would hope, but there's definitely progress in the agricultural community in the state, because certain groups have reached out to them and said, these sorts of things that you're doing are causing us water quality problems because you're creating runoff. And there are all these great ideas that can help you still farm the way you want to, but also reduce your runoff. And then the farmers have taken that, and some of them have said, yeah, that's a really good idea, and started talking amongst each other. And we're seeing these, farmer-led councils and things pop up that are working on this issue, in part because the people that were on the water came to them and started conversations, not adversarially, but in a collaborative fashion, and said, this is a problem that we all need to fix. It's all our responsibility. Help us with this if you can. And there has been progress. The same sort of thing can happen with the whole community of lake users. So I encourage everyone to think about who it is that your group talks to. If you were on the last call, we're talking about external capacity that we talked about last week. Get out and talk to people. And then the last thing, the sort of self-interested ask, is support what we're doing. And that can come in a number of different forms. Follow what we're doing. If we put out a call to action to talk to legislators or something like that on a particular item related to this, do it. Talk to your legislators. Even if we don't talk to your legislators about these sorts of issues, the earlier that they come to an understanding that there's an issue, and if it comes from their own constituents, So I'm not talking about talking to Robin Voss, unless you live in the Racine area, but talk to your own legislators and let them know that these kind of impacts are causing problems, that there may be things that need to be done down the way. The other thing I'm just going to say very quickly, because this I don't like doing this sort of thing on this sort of venue, but I think it's important to say is that we, Wisconsin Lakes, have a limited capacity to do this sort of work because we're small. We are just me, as I said before, and one other person who does mostly the membership and fundraising work. So I'm the one that does the lion's share of the work on this kind of stuff. To really do this well, we need at least another half-time person that's helping me out. And to do that, we need funding. And to get the funding, this isn't necessarily the kind of stuff that comes easily through grant funding. It's probably not something that we're going to get funded by the state. So if your association or your district or you personally have the ability to give a little bit extra to help us out with this, this is a time and this is an issue that if we're going to get it done, unfortunately, fundraising is going to be something that we have to look at. So that's my only pitch. If you're interested, you can give it wisconsinlakes.org, and I'm off the fundraising soapbox now. So that actually is about all I have, and I'm completely open to any discussion or questions at this point. So Eric, if we have anything, let me know.
Yeah, it was one thing that's kind of a comment or question. When we talk about things like 100 feet from shore, 200 feet from shore, we kind of always run into a bit of a practical question of who knows what exactly 200 feet looks like or 100 feet. Have you seen anything, Mike, that kind of helps people understand, I guess, what these distances look like when you're on the water?
The short answer is no, and this is not only a comment that I hear from just citizens, but I also hear it from law enforcement, especially when you're talking about the even longer, going to an ordinance that has 300, 400, 700 feet without some sort of rangefinder device. It's very, very difficult to be able to say in a way that's enforceable that this person was doing this outside that zone. That's a really good question, though. If there are some tricks that people can use, I think probably would be dependent on your water body. If you know that if it's a relatively narrow stretch, you may know how far it is across, and so you can sort of judge what the halfway point is and break it down from there. But if it's a big wide open body of water, yeah, it's definitely not going to be really easy to figure out.
I've seen photos, at least, of one group that at the boat landings on the lake, they kind of mark, 0 being sort of maybe the top of the concrete pad that goes down to the water, and then they go back on land up the road that leads to the boat landing and put up a sign that marks this is 100 feet from the landing. Then you can back up another 100 feet. It requires you to have a nice straight road that leads to the landing to make it resonate. But it is something that can impact people who are coming and going on the lake to appreciate or at least see what 100 and 200 feet looks like.
Right. And it looks like in the chat, Karen suggested something similar that you can do easily just with people figuring that out on land. Where it gets difficult is that, it's a wide open stretch of water. So if you learn 100 feet to your friend by judging where he is in relation to that tree, that doesn't necessarily help you when you get out when you're looking out onto the lake. So, trying to do it figure it out in an open area can be helpful.
I always thought it'd be interesting to do like a contest on a lake and have some boaters, on sort of not running around, but just sort of gathering at a place and saying, okay, well, you're all going to estimate what 100 feet and 200 feet looks like. If you measured it ahead of time, then you can come up with like a winner. You could give them a prize to see who is best at estimating this distance. Deborah had a question in the chat about how you kind of do the math you were doing, the algebra. No,
I think it would be geometry.
Geometry, thank you.
Yeah, I am a former attorney. I am not a math whiz by any stretch of the imagination. I literally just Googled area of a circle. That was another reason to use a perfectly round water body, because it fit the way the calculators online use. So basically, I just took you figure out the area of a circle by using its radius, pi r squared, and figured out the area of the circle with the 100-foot taken out, and came up with that acreage.
And for a circle or a square or a triangle, it's relatively easy. Unfortunately, a lot of our lakes are shaped more like amoebas, and there's no easy equation to do there. One of the things I would encourage people to do if they really wanted to delve into this is to work with their county and find out who runs the geographic information system within their county, and talk to them about this project and say, we just want to do some math here about our lake. And the county will have actually the boundaries of every lake within the county mapped out on a computer. And then the exercise we're talking about of calculating that area, it's a pretty simple exercise when you have GIS, geographic information systems software, and kind of what you're doing, which most of the county staff who work with GIS, they should be able to help you out with that. So if you're on a big enough lake, or if there's just lakes in your county where you want to go to the county and talk to them about this, I'd encourage people to reach out to them. And someone else mentioned Lake Ripley had some methods in there about calculating area. We can open the mics too. So Joe, if you want, Joe Buchanan, looks like you might have a question. If you want to unmute yourself.
I just did. And my question is, are there grad students or somebody else out there who would be qualified to perform this kind of lake capacity study? And if so, how do I find one or two of them?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for you on that. I'm sure that there would be, some of the lake consultant groups that do lake management plans, or it might be something that could be done through a lake management planning process, I'm guessing, would be able to help out with those sorts of things. And I didn't check this with anyone, but Eric, I would assume that something like this should be a surface water grant fundable, I would think.
Yeah, and if I had to guess, I'd say the Lake Ripley study was funded by the Wisconsin DNR surface water grants. And so again, if you want to go down that road, start talking with your regional lakes biologist, get this idea out to them. They're going to be looking for sort of those pre-applications at the end of summer. So if you really wanted to get knee deep into this, start talking to folks now. I appreciate what you're saying about a graduate student. As someone who works on campus and knows a little bit about what Stevens Point is like, and I did graduate school at UW-Madison, I think it'd be difficult to find the right person. The process at which a professor and graduate students work on oftentimes is spread out over years. But as Mike was suggesting, there might be some people who have their degrees now and they're working in lake planning and lake management, and they may be willing to help you out with this.
There have been some comments about the disturbances because of shallow waters in the chat that I see. And I just want to throw out that there is a presentation at the Northwest Wisconsin Lakes Conference, which is coming up a week from tomorrow. It will be an expanded version of a presentation that was given at Wisconsin Water Week by the folks at North Lake Management District, Captain Tim Tyre and Mike Mortensen, who have been doing a study, they were a year into it, of the impacts of different types of boats and their wakes on using aerial drone coverage, surface water cameras, and underwater cameras. And it's, if nothing else, it's extremely striking when you see the film of how different waves impact at different points. So they do, I think it's a jet ski, just a general pontoon boat, and a wake boat from different distances to see what happens under the water, and it's pretty striking how much stuff gets kicked up by the bigger the wakes get. So if you go to nwwislakesconference.org, you will be able to register for that. It's $10, get a whole day of stuff. But that one, I believe that presentation is at 1 o'clock.
And I just put the link in the chat. I would plug the Northwest Lakes Conference. If you find Zoom to be a reasonable way to learn about these things at that conference, they have multiple tracks, so you're not beholden to any one specific topic. And of course, you can come and go as you please. Let's see, I don't see anybody raising their hand. I put in the chat there that you might want to raise your hand just so we don't get people speaking on top of each other. Scott Provost commented about that.
Hello?
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
This is Joe Buchanan again.
Sure.
Have you heard of anyone who's demanded that a local government unit that's attempting to dramatically expand a boat landing perform one of these studies as far as an environmental impact before they can go forward?
I have not, Mike.
I haven't specifically. I don't know that I would argue against it if it was proposed. I think.
I don't know if Scott is still on the call. The term environmental impact statement or even environmental assessment have very specific legal definitions. And so we all want to say like, oh, we just want to measure the possible impact. That's one thing you could do. But when you enter into something like an environmental assessment or a impact analysis, those can be extremely expensive and rigorous. So we usually require those, like if someone was going to build another giant dam on the Wisconsin River, they would have to do this. When the last dam was going to be built in Western Wisconsin, they had to do a study like that, and it actually caused them to not build the dam. So be careful in how you use that language, but I see what you're saying, that it should be something that people could look at the potential impacts and have a better understanding. I would say there's also been cases where local lake districts have sued the DNR to argue against a boat landing being located on their lake. And that's certainly a possible strategy. I don't necessarily advocate it. I think it's always going to be better if we can work out differences. But I know in Southeast Wisconsin, things have been controversial in the past.
The idea of doing one of these kind of carrying capacity studies, though, when a landing is being suggested or put in place, it's not just, it has benefits not just from the environmental impact side, but also from the social side that I was talking about. So the looking at, is this likely to allow an increase in traffic that's going to start causing safety or satisfaction issues? And keeping in mind all those 4 goals that Lowell had suggested. There was a question, I think, earlier that I had seen. Oh, Chris asked, if you declare a 300-foot zone from shore to deter wake boating, does that no wake rule apply to all boats? That's actually a really good question. Kind of depends. I think the safest way to write that kind of ordinance to not run into public trust problems probably is to have that apply to all boats, which may not be acceptable for understandable reasons. There have been jurisdictions that have tried to, instead of limiting the boat, they limit the size of the wake, which is also somewhat hard to do from an enforcement standpoint. At what point is it is the wake too tall? At one point does it become determined to be enhanced? Is the term I usually use. So yeah, that is certainly an issue. I think it was in Minnesota maybe that the legislation would have set a 250-foot distance from shore, and it did not pass. And I think one of the reasons was, I believe, it would have applied to all watercraft, and that sort of helped defeat that.
Like, I don't know if there's a comment too from someone that maybe some lake groups go around and remove, it sounds like, take down public boat launch signs regularly to try to, disguise the fact that there might be access. Does that sound?
I haven't heard of that. Wouldn't completely surprise me. I don't know that I would recommend that course of action. I think it probably creates more problems than it solves in the long run. The time is probably better spent doing the sort of relationship building that I talked about than hiding the fact that there's access, especially if it's been put up by a local government. You're probably running into some problems of stealing local government property. So
I'd also point out, like, more and more often people are not using just the signs to find out where they're going. They have GPS in their car. They go to the DNR webpage. You can see exactly where the boat landings are. You can GPS them on your phone, and it shouldn't be too hard. I don't know how many people are driving around just hoping to find a boat landing somewhere. I think most people have a specific destination in mind, and they go for that. One thing I wanted to mention too, much earlier, Mike, you talked about displacement. And I think part of what has exacerbated the challenge in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota for the last year has been that Canada has not been available as a place for people to go fishing. So there is some percentage of fishing demand in this north central region that's actually met on Canadian lakes. And if you can't get to those, then your next best alternative is keeping it local. And so I do believe that we saw quite a bit of uptick in recreational use just driven by the fact that people couldn't travel across the border. And it's my understanding that the border might still be tightly regulated. There's discussions of it opening up this summer. Clearly, a lot of tourism-based communities in Ontario and other places are hoping that the border opens up. I don't know if anybody on the call has any updates about what's going on with the Canadian situation, but I know they put a lot of fishing pressure on lakes.
There was a question about if you, from Dave, if you have a town road that goes all the way down to the landing, how do you manage that? Of course, Dave and I have talked about this issue, so I know exactly what you're talking about, Dave, and you're in a sticky place, but I think it brings up I guess another call for the need to try to establish good relationships early on. And if the town controls the landing or the road leading to the landing, the parking in the landing, that the town is going to have a lot of control over what happens there. And that's an issue that is potentially a very sticky widget that is going to have to be overcome. Sometimes these problems are very difficult and can be intractable. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep working on them. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't look to other ways that maybe if you're having a capacity problem on the lake, that you can look to control things. I unfortunately don't have a great answer for you on that, but I am happy if other lakes are having particular specific issues with thorny problems, I'm happy to talk to you to try to help brainstorm some ideas of what you might be able to do. If nothing else, it gives me more information about the kinds of problems that are out there. Other questions that people have? I appreciate everyone for sticking around and listening to what ended up being a longer talk than I did this earlier in the day, and I went through it much faster than I did today. I was surprised at the time when I finished, but.
For folks that are still here, I did put another link in the chat. We have a book that was put out by Extension Lakes a few years ago, just sort of It is, again, more of a philosophical approach, but also it takes into account some of the Wisconsin laws and nuances. So the book was called How's the Water? I recommend checking that out. It's a fairly low cost. It's a thick book. Mike, did you ever find your copy?
So I was going to say, I didn't, I was going to bring it up. I was hoping maybe you would bring it. I did not refer to that in this talk because Wisconsin Lakes has downsized. We dispensed with our physical office. And so much of our stuff is in storage. Most everything that I've needed has been easily accessible, and I'm having no problems working at home, except I know we have like a number of copies of that book, but that is one thing that I was not able to find. So I'm glad you brought it up, Eric, because it has been a long time since I've read it, but I haven't. It is a useful, has some useful information.
And a lot of you folks probably recognize what was happening in the 1990s that probably caused Lowell Klessig and Bob Kors to be working on this. And if you look back to past Wisconsin Lakes Partnership conventions, jet skis were exploding on the scene in the early 90s and causing all sorts of conflict. And so people were really struggling to manage jet skis. And I wouldn't say we've like solved jet skis by any means, but the level of conflict and vitriol that existed in the 90s sort of tempered down. And I guess we anticipate over time we'll come to a much better place. And part of that was regulatory too, right, Mike? I mean, they did set up regulations that were specific to jet skis. And that helped manage the issue. And so don't think that it can't be done either. Like that's part of the solution, I think, to all these recreation conflicts.
Yeah, and I think, you know, with jet skis too, it's over a length of time, the users got educated, and so they began to understand how better to use those things. It doesn't mean that there aren't still bad actors out there, but anytime a new technology gets adopted, people don't quite understand how to use it, and you don't want to just throw those people out and you know, attack them in an ad hoc fashion, because then they become defensive and then it's harder to get people to change. There are always going to be bad actors, and with some of the technology that we have now, the potential for negative impact is much higher than it was with jet skis, which is why, you know, wake boats are a continued area of focus for us, and certainly one of the things that we're looking at as far as recreational impacts. But I do want to sort of circle back to the point that it's you can't, even if your lake is having a lot of problems with wake boats, keep in mind that there are other lakes that are having other problems. For some people, it's a problem of you know, being they're surrounded by lakes that have zebra mussels, and so they're very worried about having zebra mussels or some other invasive species discovered on their lake being brought in. For some lakes, it's rentals and campgrounds and the pressures that they bring with all sorts of different recreational uses as a result. So all of those sorts of things have to come into play. And what we're trying to do is think about this holistically, and for each of those kind of problems, help come up with some solutions.
All right, does anybody else have questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Sure. John?
There's been a number of links put on the chat room. And I'm wondering, is there a place, and I'm not quick enough to have been able to copy all of them. Is there a place that I'm going to be able to go and get those links, or just look at the chat?
Yeah, what we will do, John, is we're recording the session. We'll post that to YouTube and link it back on that page. But then what I'll do is I'll email everybody who registered. So we had about 80 people at the highest in here today. We had over 120 people register. Everybody who registered, we'll just send them an email that includes the link to the video, as well as the links that were included in here to things like the Klessig study, the the Lake Ripley plan, other documents, we'll include that in that email. So look for that in your inbox. If not tomorrow, then it'll be early next week. But we do want to get that out to you.
That would be great. I appreciate, it was a very good program.
Yeah.
It'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Mike and I appreciate what you all do. You're volunteering for the most part. You're taking time out of your day to learn about lake issues, but also to engage with your community. So I want to take a chance to thank you all for what you do for lakes. This is all part of a partnership. The only way this all works is because a lot of people collaborate together. So thank you all for what you're doing. In addition to that email, there'll be another email. One final one that we're going to send out to everybody who signed up for all of these workshops, just to get some feedback for us. So Mike mentioned this is the end of the spring season for us. We're going to take a summer hiatus. Northwest Lakes is next Friday, so you can get that. There'll be some others, I'm sure, educational programming during the summer. But we do, one thing that's come out of this whole experience over the last year and a half has been a recognition that we can reach a lot of people using web meetings like this. In some places they are left behind. The technology is not available everywhere, but we are able to reach a lot of people. So it just makes sense for us to figure out ways to continue doing this stuff, because the state of Wisconsin is big enough. It's a huge drive just to go from, say, Walworth County to Douglas County. And if we can meet online, it makes things a lot easier. Saves time and saves money. All right, if there's no other comments, I'm going to go ahead and close things out. But thank you all. Stay cool. Have a good summer. And we will talk to you soon. You'll get an email from us either Friday or Monday. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Eric.